Welcome to this episode of Hacktics and Telemetry. My name is Douglas McKee, and I'm one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined by the one and only CryptoCat. And this is actually going to be a special edition of Hacktics and Telemetry, where we are going to talk about one specific topic through the entire time. We are going to take a deep dive into Pwn2Own. And as a result of that, we are joined by our senior principal vulnerability researcher here at Rapid7, Stephen Feuer, who is a 5-time Pwn2Own veteran. So we are very fortunate to have someone with us that has participated on a regular basis in Pwn2Own. Like always, if you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get all the latest updates from the podcast that we release on a bi-weekly basis. And feel free to add comments in the comment section. We'd love to hear from our viewers on exactly what you are finding interesting, maybe what you want the next special edition to be on for Hacktics and Telemetry. As I said, we're going to break the format that we traditionally use here, which is the 3 different rooms. We're just going to run right at it here and talk about a little bit of the history of Pwn2Own, what we've seen happen over the years, and dive into some of the vulnerabilities a little bit that have been described. So we think this would be an interesting topic for our viewers. And CryptoCat, like always, going to kick it over to you. Why don't you kick us off with a little bit of background here on Pwn2Own?
Yeah, all right. Well, the last Pwn2Own that occurred was the biggest yet, with 47 0 days, unique 0 days, and $1.3 million given in prize money. And it was also plagued with AI submissions, either AI targets or vulnerabilities that have been found, with the assistance of AI, exploit development, and all that.
Well, it's interesting to have AI in multiple facets here, right? So we had AI helping researchers, and we also had AI as a target. And I would think that contributed to both of those things contributed to the vulnerability count increasing, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and also it contributed to some people not getting accepted to Pwn2Own, which we've talked about a little bit as well.
Yeah, we've mentioned that on a previous episode as well, people not getting access to it, which I think is a bit of a sad evolution there.
Yeah,
so we've seen what? If we go back and we look at, we say 47 is a lot of vulnerabilities. If we go back and look at previous years, I believe for the same, now Pwn2Own, for those that may not know, has 3 different competitions each year. Keep me honest here, Stephen, that I'm not saying things too far out of track here. They don't always happen in the same location, but they usually have one focused around enterprise software. That's the most recent one that we've seen that Stephen has participated in. There's also usually one focused around IoT and consumer technology, and then there's one focused around vehicles and that type of specific technology as well. And if we look at when you talk about the 47 vulnerabilities, we're specifically, just for our viewers that don't know which competition you're referring to, that's the enterprise competition. And for some context, typically we've seen vulnerabilities reported in the mid to upper 20s, like less than 30 is common. So jumping to 47 is a pretty steep jump. Now, as I said, Stephen has participated in what is it, 5 Pwn2Own, Stevens, one way or the other?
Yeah, over the years, since I think 2011 was the first time I participated, and then this year, at Berlin, I brought a SharePoint exploit, which unfortunately wasn't successful on the day, but that was my 5th participation at the contest.
2011 makes some of us feel pretty old, huh? When we're talking about
me too, right?
in the context of Pwn2Own. So here's a good question for you, Stephen. Since you participated since 2011 in different facets, and then you got to see the competition this year, where we do have both AI as a target and as being used researcher, what do you think are some of the biggest changes you've seen over that time?
That's a great question. Really, Pwn2Own has been going for so long. I think the first edition was maybe, I'm going to say 2007. It's kind of tracked the evolution of vulnerability research, obviously, over the years, because, it's a 0-day exploit contest. The targets are always hard targets, they're obviously fully patched. And as, software gets more secure or mitigations get deployed and so on, the bar gets raised for how to exploit them. So it's been a good kind of metric of tracking what's possible and what's not possible over the years. That said, every year people turn up with 0-day exploits, and, pwn the targets. So what we can kind of take from that is attackers still currently, even though AI is currently, we're very much actively in the process of seeing AI change things for us in the world of vulnerability research. And researchers have always been on top, and been able to successfully produce exploits against the latest version of the software over the, year on year. So I think it's a really interesting metric from that point. And I think what's interesting now is obviously with the advent of AI, how that's going to change and maybe what the future looks like and how that might change and look different, and that maybe researchers won't always have the upper hand. And I think one kind of glimpse of how that is going to present itself. We mentioned like researchers not getting accepted with, there's so many researchers applying. We saw all the targets, not all the targets, we saw the majority of targets that had entries this year in the Berlin contest for the enterprise software categories were compromised, with one exception that I'm aware of, which is Firefox. We did see there were a pile of entries for Firefox, as well as a pile of rejections for Firefox. And for various reasons, none of the Firefox entries or the entries that were, made it to the contest were actually successful. They got patched out in the end. And I think that's probably a direct result of the influence of AI in this space. We know Mozilla, for example, has access or has had access to Mythos over the last maybe month or two. And we've seen publicly that they've been disclosing, squashing a lot of bugs and pushing a lot of patches that have been killing a lot of bugs. And I think we can take from that AI is going to have a dramatic impact in terms of, killing bugs and ultimately breaking exploit chains and affecting, the results, the measurable, demonstrable results at a contest like Pwn2Own. So I think the Firefox category is the first kind of early indication of what might be in the store for us in the future.
There's a lot to unpack there. Go ahead, John. I'll let you jump in. Go for it.
Just thinking about the Firefox thing there, I know Live Overflow, I think in the last Pwn2Own did like a mini documentary where he kind of followed the Firefox team. And they made a blog series about it, about how they actually treat Pwn2Own as like a live incident. They use it for like testing, how quickly they can patch. Can they like go back and see if there's any evidence of, of it being used before? So I think like we've talked quite a bit about curl and how they've dealt with all the AI vulnerabilities come in and how they're in quite a good, stand-in, even with Mythos being released. Maybe it's the same with Firefox. Maybe it's a good example of a company that's taken security quite seriously.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. And I think that kind of points to one of the kind of big wins that vendors can get out of a contest like Pwn2Own is actually engaging with it and, engaging with the researchers and taking on the research and taking it back and learning from it, but actively participating. Not all vendors turn up. Vendors are invited by ZDI, who are the organization that run it. Not all vendors turn up. So not all vendors, take advantage of the opportunity to get in the research, engage directly with the researchers, and kind of move and grow from there. So I think Firefox, credit to them that they have, used the competition for that purpose, and it's been demonstrably good for them, I think.
That's a concept that holds true across offensive security in general. I think it's interesting, the vendors that embrace vulnerability research or offensive security, those vendors end up ahead, right? Because you're leveraging, in some aspects, nothing's free in today's world, but in some aspects, you're getting free testing and the ability to improve your project at a very good ROI for your company, whether that's Pwn2Own or whether that's just a vulnerability researcher submitting resource to you. You're not paying them. There's bug bounties, yes, and all that, right? But like for the most part, you're getting a really good ROI on that investment. And I think the takeaway there is the companies that are willing to embrace that process and embrace those competitions are going to end up ahead defensively. And I think Mozilla there is a fantastic example of that for sure. I lost my train of thought there. I forget where I was going with that, but Jonah,
I've got a question. Yeah, so Stephen, quite a lot of people won't really know all the ins and outs of Pwn2Own and how it works. So can you tell us a little bit about like the rules, how it goes for, determining who goes first, the submissions, what happens if there's a collision, how long do you have for your attempts? Is there any kind of restrictions about the setup, the environment, things like that?
Yeah, sure thing. The competition runs for usually 2 or 3 days at a particular venue. So that's either Ireland for the IoT edition currently, Berlin for the enterprise edition, or currently Tokyo for the automotive edition. But what happens is about 3 months prior to the contest actually taking place on site, ZDI will announce what the targets are for the upcoming edition. And then this gives researchers the legroom or the space to, acquire the targets, do the research and actually produce, 1 or more zero-day exploits. So the contest really begins like 3 months out, when you get the target list and you decide, you want to participate, and you're going to pick one of the targets from the list that makes sense to you, or more than one, obviously, and try and do the research and find the bugs and make it to the contest. Of course, before you do have to produce, a working exploit, but you have to survive getting patched out in between whenever you start to find bugs and the time you actually turn up to the contest, so that's the first challenge is just not getting patched out before the contest even begins. Then, of course, you have to register. So you contact ZDI and say you want to participate. Typically, that's a very straightforward process. Obviously, this year, just due to the volume, there was issues with the contest is held in Berlin during Offensive Con in Berlin. So there's limited space, there's limited hours in the day that it can actually, practically run. Every attempt takes a certain amount of time and the setup time and so on. So there's a constraint on the amount of entries that can actually occur. Sadly, this year, some people were unfortunately unsuccessful in registering. But assuming you can register, you're invited to join, and then you just turn up on the day. You will be given a slot for your attempt. And the order here is important because obviously there may be many contestants who enter against the same target as you. Everybody wants to go first because the order of who goes first and who's successful affects the scoring and the payouts. So to kind of make this as fair as possible, ZDI, the day before the contest begins, will do a random drawing of order where they put all the names in the hat of all the contestants who are going to turn up, each for every individual target. And they'll pull out a name and a target out of the hat. And that dictates the order of who goes first against all the targets. And there's an advantage here, of course, is if you go first, the first person who successfully demonstrates a zero-day exploit gets the full amount of points, but also the full bounty amount, the full payout amount, and then it can decrease then based on the outcomes. So if you go second, there's every chance that the vulnerabilities you've used, one or more of them, will actually collide with someone who's gone before you, and that if there's a bug collision, that affects the payouts and the point scoring. So there's a tactical advantage to being lucky in the draw and going first. So that's kind of the next thing. You have to survive not getting patched out by the vendor. Then you have to, in a certain way, survive the drawing for order and get a good position, ideally first. Or if you get second or third, it's a competition. So I guess you're kind of hoping that the person ahead of you will not be successful.
It's a bit like the Battle Royale games. You have people who just get really good at them, really skilled players, but you always have to drop in, and it depends where you land and what loot you can pick up and, who else lands near you. Yeah,
we've seen people who have, a pile of exploits and they just get a bad draw for that particular contest, and then all their entries are on day 3, and it's just rotten luck if they've put in all the work, and every entry they have has unfortunately got a bad draw, but it's random, so there's nothing you can do about it. But then so you have your
that's a little bit like a lot of sports, right? There's a large amount of skill involved, right? You have to get really good at your craft, but then there's always a little bit of luck, and I think that's just part of the game for sure.
Yeah, it makes it kind of exciting too. It's a skills-based competition, but there's definitely an element of luck involved in kind of every aspect of kind of getting to it and competing successfully. So then, when you do have your attempt, your spot has come up. Every contestant will get 30 minutes. So before that, there's a 30-minute setup time where you'll sit down, you'll resolve any networking issues, you'll get your laptop set up and all this, and it's just a quick chance to kind of troubleshoot anything that might affect your setup when you actually do perform the exploit.
You can't run it at all in that stage, right? You've got 30 minutes, but you can't do any testing.
No, nothing like that. It's really about getting your laptop set up on their network and just verifying that the target is as expected, and the network setup is as expected. You can't run your exploit or do any sort of reconnaissance or any you can't run any scripts or anything like that. It's purely just to get set up and make sure there's no kind of basic issues before you actually do your attempt.
Does Pwn2Own do most of the setup for you, or do you are you configuring whatever your target is from ground zero when you show up?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, so ZDI will set up the targets. They'll put them in a default configuration or a reasonable configuration. You do have an opportunity to discuss that with them prior to the contest, if your exploit has any kind of unusual requirements. Although unusual here would be reasonable requirements, nothing too kind of non-default that wouldn't wash. And the goal is to get an unauthenticated RCE, generally speaking, exploit against a target in a default or a reasonably default configuration. And some of these software packages are, the notion of default isn't necessarily straightforward. By virtue of how they're intended to run, have to be configured in a certain way, or because it's enterprise software, often there's many ways to configure them that would be reasonable.
So there could be a lot of dependencies too, right? So even certain things could require Active Directory, for example, yep. and I assume that ZDI handles all those type of dependencies, so you're not messing with them on the day of either.
Yeah, exactly. So if it's an enterprise piece of software, like say for SharePoint, for example, it requires a domain controller or a SQL server and so on, and a lot of configuration to get there. And ZDI will have all that done, prior to the contest starting. So you can verify that things are as you expected, but you're not actually installing anything. You're not configuring anything like in that sense. And then you have your 30-minute attempt, and that's all you get. 30 minutes goes very quickly when you sit down at the table and you fire up your laptop. And in that 30-minute window, you get 3 attempts, so 10 minutes for each attempt. And if you kind of chew up any time ironing out any issues, it all happens within that 30-minute window. So your 10-minute attempt might actually be less if you kind of use time for setting up something that you weren't expecting to set up or something like this. So you get 3 attempts. And if your exploit works, then you're successful. And if it doesn't work within those 3 attempts, then sadly you aren't.
You don't get the old adage of it works on my box. You can't just say, hey, look, works on
I wish I would have pulled that out a few times if that worked, but no, it has to actually work on their box, unfortunately. So if your attempt works, then fantastic. You will then be brought into a private room with ZDI where you'll make the disclosure, and you will talk to them and tell them everything about the vulnerability and how it works, and you'll hand over the exploit and your write-up, and they will verify from their end if they're aware of the bugs, because ZDI have their own zero-day initiative program where they buy in lots of vulnerabilities. So they actually might have in their catalog or portfolio prior knowledge of maybe one or more of the bugs you've used. So they want to verify that it's a 0-day and it's unknown to them. So they'll do that. And then if they're satisfied with everything and satisfied that it wasn't a collision with maybe another contestant who went before you, then if the vendor is present or willing to engage, they'll bring in the vendor. And the same conversation happens again where you disclose it to the vendor and you explain how it works. And the vendor then has an opportunity, and this is another advantage of the vendor engaging with ZDI. The vendor has the opportunity to push back and say, we actually know about this vulnerability, it's in our queue internally perhaps. And they'll be asked to provide evidence if that's the case. You bring up the bug tracker and show me a POC or something like this. And then this, if they did,
does that affect the prize? Like if you're successful on the day, but the vendor come up and says, "Hey, we've known about this vulnerability and it's in our bug tracker," does that change your status in the competition?
It will, unfortunately. That part of the exploit chain will be deemed a collision. And then proportionally, the payout and the points awards will be reflected in that. So if there's 3 bugs in an exploit chain and one of those bugs was a collision that the vendor could prove, proportionally that one bug will be kind of demoted a little bit in terms of the payout.
I don't know how I feel about that. Even if they haven't patched it, it's not publicly available.
Well, Doug, at least they're tracking that, right? They have to prove it. This is very, very common in bug bounty for companies to say, we already knew about that internally. We've known about that for a month, and they don't generally have to provide any evidence to show like we actually knew about that, so they can really just say it on any case.
Here they have to provide evidence, which I think is great because you have that engagement and everybody can talk it out, either in person or over like a video call. And then after that happens, we'll say goodbye to the vendor. All
right, Stephen. So that's how the competition works. Do you have any advice for people who maybe never done the competition before and they see a new one's coming on in a few months' time? There's a big target list. How do you pick one? You mentioned that you might pick a few of them. I'm guessing some of them require some like specialized hardware or maybe just specialized skills as well. Any tips?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say would be go for it. You miss the shots you don't take. So from that perspective, give it a go. You might surprise yourself on what might be easier than you think it would be. In terms of picking targets, I would lean into like your existing skills or maybe areas that you're interested in. Generally, with the 3 editions of the contest, that there's a broad variety of targets from like, embedded hardware devices to like enterprise software or automotive things. So perhaps you have like prior experience in some area here. So lean into that, obviously. Each edition of the contest tends to have, a variety of targets within that edition of the contest. Maybe you don't jump in the deep end and develop like an ESXi exploit. If, you're not familiar with binary exploitation to begin with. So find a target that you feel is kind of in your area. But I would suggest picking several. My approach is usually to try and pick like 2 or 3 that seem interesting, either because I have experience, with the target, so I have some prior work I can just ramp up really quickly with, or because I think it's an under-researched target. Maybe it's in the IoT edition, maybe like an unknown device or a brand that you wouldn't think perhaps they have a huge amount of a great security posture, which can sometimes surprise you. You can peek under the hood and all of a sudden you realize actually they do have a great security posture. So picking a few targets is probably a good kind of starting point. And then generally I like to look at several targets kind of quickly in succession, just to get a sense of their architecture a sense of the code quality, a sense of, what might I expect, any low-hanging fruit. And then from, that kind of initial observation of 2 or 3 targets, pick one of them to focus on and do a deep dive and dig in for, several weeks, possibly even a month or 2, depending on if you start to make some headway. So yeah, I would cast the net wide, look around, and then kind of narrow things down pretty quickly. But definitely, there's lots of opportunity there. I think don't approach it thinking it's too complex. There are, it does get complex, but there are, it's approachable, and a lot of these targets, we see quite a few bug classes across the spectrum, from very complex, binary corruption or binary exploitation to logic issues to, there's a wide variety of things you can end up exploiting. So there's opportunity there for, I think, a lot of folks to dig in with.
I think too, like a lot of the same general advice that you have when doing vulnerability research, one thing that I've always told researchers is have multiple targets so that when you get stuck on one, you can still be making progress on something else. Like I think it's always good mentally to have multiple projects to bounce around between. And sometimes if you can pick targets that have similar qualities, sometimes working on one target, you'll learn something that is not specific to that target, but you'll come up with something or help craft a skill that they then use on the other target, right? It just kind of helps to have that in your back pocket. So I think that's great advice for vuln research in general, not just necessarily Pwn2Own. And I think since we have to talk about AI and everything that we do now, I think that, how do you think AI changes that when you're talking about working on multiple targets? Because it's almost to a sense now with some of these harnesses and workflows that you could easily say, I'm going to work on 6 targets. And when I say work on them, I'm going to put them all in different AI harnesses and be giving different prompts across all 6 targets to see what it can find. Obviously, this term has now been ridiculously overused, but the whole force multiplier term when it comes to AI, it's really an interesting conversation to have from that perspective. Do you think that changes target selection at all, Stephen, or how you approach it, but the ability to leverage AI to help get started?
In terms of target selection, I think you can still be strategic about your target selection. I think to your point of being a force multiplier, absolutely you can scale, probably exponentially with AI and how much resources and basically tokens you're willing to or can spend on things. There are some limitations in terms of like getting the hardware. If it's a hardware based thing, so maybe automotive or the IoT edition, there are some maybe practical constraints of like acquiring the firmware isn't always trivial, and pulling it from the device or dealing with encryption and so on. Sometimes that can be very complex, and maybe AI can give you some advice there, but it could be a challenge to do the kind of the physical kind of side of things. So that might impact you. But in terms of the vuln research, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing it being so successful in what it can do when used well, either with a kind of a frontier model or with proper harnessing. It's very capable, and it can certainly bridge skill gaps or bridge, if you're blocked in a certain aspect of an exploit chain, maybe you don't have one component to tie things together. AI is a fantastic tool to help bridge these gaps. So absolutely, it changes things, and I think we saw that in terms of the volume in the recent edition of the contest.
I think correct me if I'm wrong, but there's nothing that's stopping you from submitting multiple bugs and multiple products to Pwn2Own, right? So hypothetically, there's quite a bit of money to be made there if you are able to find bugs across multiple targets within the same competition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more entries you can get into the contest, the more potential you have to get big payouts. I suppose one thing would be to note the maybe the limitations of AI and what we don't know how good it is currently. We saw one exploit chain, I think is a good call out this year from DevCore, which was a 4-bug logic chain against Edge, Microsoft Edge. And I think that's a fascinating bug chain because it's in a browser. It's, it cheated sandbox escape for arbitrary code execution. And all 4 bugs were logic bugs chained together. It'd be interesting to know how good an agentic system is at that kind of piecing together, finding those bugs and piecing together those kind of exploit chains over like a binary code base, a large binary code base. So I think that, AI probably it has, I don't think we know its limits yet, and how those limits affect vulnerability research and, where the practical kind of edge of what current capabilities are basically. So there's still probably space, I think, for research.
I definitely don't intend to paint a picture where like it solves all the problems and is going to completely, because we've talked about that on this podcast before, right? Like there's a very important human aspect to finding these bugs. It's just interesting to consider how your strategy might change, even if something as simple as picking a target with the newest technology.
And I think one thing is the kind of counterpoint to that is the collisions, which we saw this year with, for example, Firefox being a good example. If everybody's using the same tools with the same or similar capabilities, it stands to reason that there will be a lot of duplications in terms of what's found. So that's a negative in terms of a competition where you want to compete with a unique entry. That's one negative aspect. I think that if you can be more creative to either have an edge or find something unique, that's beneficial to you from a competition perspective.
Talking about AI in the competition there as well, I can't remember what the submissions were, but I saw some tweets from Chompy saying that she got one of the vulnerabilities that she got, she just used like a $20 Claude subscription to find the chain. And then the other bug was a bug which Claude basically was gaslighting her so hard, saying that it wasn't possible to write this exploit, that she was like, I'm going to show Claude wrong, I know how to do this. And it was kind of funny seeing like two submissions, both AI, but one of them was like, oh, it helped me find this. The other one's like, oh, it told me I couldn't find this.
Yeah, I mean, that stands to the human researcher side of things, where you know the limits of the system you're using and your own capabilities, and you can, advance past and push forward and actually show it can be exploited. So yeah, that's cool.
All right. So next I was going to show a write-up from last year. Do you want to check that out now?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, cool. Let me share this window. Okay, can you see that? All right, this is one from Star Labs. And I picked this one to show for a couple of reasons. It's not the most recent one. One reason is we've been talking about firmware downgrades as part of attacks. We talked about that with the SD-WAN vulnerabilities. Me and Stephen looked at one in ETR, and then we found a similar 0-day as well. And we knew that threat actors in the wild were actually using the auth bypass and then downgrading the firmware using old vulnerabilities. Well, it's not just attackers that do that. You can also have researchers that do the same. And in this case, Star Labs used the firmware rollback so that they could actually use buffer overflow in the brother printers, which Stephen found the year before. So I thought this would be a good example to take a look at.
Yeah, no, this is a cool chain, and especially because we found and disclosed both the auth bypass and the buffer overflow to brother almost 2 years ago now. And so Brother could issue a firmware update to fix the buffer overflow, but the root cause of the auth bypass was essentially a design issue. Baked into the production or the manufacturing process of a huge amount of devices, so it couldn't actually be fixed in a huge amount of devices. So it seems here that they were able to use the unpatchable auth bypass to roll back to the vulnerable firmware to then hit the buffer overflow. So that's very cool. And exploiting a printer, especially in terms of memory corruption, is it's tricky for debugging purposes. So very cool work by Star Labs.
Did you find any new vulnerabilities, or did they just chain together pre-existing vulnerabilities differently? Because based on
I think it was just pre-existing ones. Now I'll scroll down here a little bit. This was the auth bypass, and I'll show a little bit more of this in a second, because I made a kind of a challenge based on this, which some people might be interested in taking a look at if they want to do like a mini Pwn2Own. But so there was the auth bypass to generate the credentials. You leak from the SNMP endpoint in this case to get the serial number, and you can generate the password for it from that.
That's the one that wasn't really patchable.
That wasn't patchable, yeah, because it was basically in like a separate piece of software, right, Stephen? It was used whenever the printers were being manufactured, and they used this algorithm to generate the key, which got put in the printer. So because that was a separate component altogether, there was no way to patch it in the device.
Yeah, they had to change the manufacturing process so that new printers rolling off the production lines had a different scheme for developing their default admin print passwords, but all the existing stuff, they couldn't change that because they would break all the IT infrastructure for managing printers, because the scheme was also baked into their IT management software, so it was unfixable from that perspective.
Now, we're talking about some of the difficulties there, and this is what most of the article is actually about, because that stuff was already found, right? Most of it is the actual hardware stuff here. I know that they said they were trying to find a UART port on it, and I believe they didn't find a UART port. Where was it? They found...
Did they get JTAG maybe or something?
Yes, I believe so. I can't see it now, but yeah, I think that was it. And once they did actually dump the firmware, I think they had some issues as well. There was like a hardware watch on it. Oh yeah, here we go. So they weren't able to identify UART console pins, but they found the JTAG. They were able to get that connected. They dumped the firmware, but I think it was whenever they were trying to emulate it or trying to run it.
Watchdog timer issues?
Yeah, exactly. That's what they ran into. And so basically, I think they had to patch it or put some kind of instrumentation around it to basically get around that, which I guess
that's so common with these type of hardwares when you're trying to mess with the firmware to have to deal with these watchdogs.
Yeah, this is really impressive because the the Brother hardware stack, as far as I'm aware, it's all like proprietary, like custom chipsets and so on. I think it's ARM based, but I'm pretty sure it's like, not off the shelf chips. So, figuring out the debugging interface, figuring out how to, get that introspection and start manipulating and debugging on the device is hugely impressive. So this is cool to see. And this is, I think, I'm not aware of any other binary exploitation against Brother devices like this. So this is a very cool publication from startups.
Yeah. Now I noticed they did.
I want to pull that for a second. So Stephen, what's different in the way that, because you have some vulnerabilities that you found in Brother as well. So what was different in your approach versus what's happening here?
Yeah. So from my approach, when I did the research against the Brother devices, I was able to unpack the firmware from the publicly available download, for example, which was because at that time, Brother weren't encrypting the firmware downloads, or, the actual firmware itself. That's since changed, I believe. So that let me get access to the firmware. Then I never established a hardware debugging capability. So for example, when I found the stack-based buffer overflow, that was through reverse engineering, but I never leveraged it for exploitation. So because I didn't have a hardware capability set up for debugging.
Gotcha.
I also noticed, they didn't get RC on this. I think the function, they specifically redirected the execution to a function which would, it's a longer article than I thought. Let me scroll through.
Yeah, there's a lot of work here. It's very cool.
Yeah. It was the buffer overflow still in the referrer header, and they redirected it. Oh, this is still going through the setup exploitation strategy, crafting the exploit. Oh, there we go. Okay, they wanted to display the text on the printer's LCD screen, so they found a function which basically does that. So they didn't actually take it to like RCE, and maybe that was because this was a Pwn2Own entry, but it was actually patched on the final day of registration. So correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen. This would they have had to show? Do they just have to show? Is it fine just to jump to a function which doesn't necessarily do something malicious in this case? Like they don't have control of. They've got control of the screen of the printer, but is that generally enough for Pwn2Own?
I think for these particular kind of embedded devices, yes, because it does show that you've corrupted memory in a certain way, and you've changed like the instruction pointer, for example. So you are executing attacker chosen commands or instructions. So it is arbitrary code execution from that perspective. So I think it definitely meets the bar. And also for these kind of devices, it's always somewhat of a relief, I guess, when you're reversing embedded devices, if it ends up being a small embedded like Linux system, just because that's such a familiar environment. And it opens up the doors for kind of familiar payloads like a reverse bash shell or something like this. But on something like the Brother printer, not only is the hardware, it's a proprietary hardware stack, but the actual, the embedded operating system running on the device is proprietary Brother. It's not a Linux system. So developing a payload is challenging because, what would that even look like? What do sockets look like? Does it even have a shell? These are kind of challenges you have to run up against for these sort of devices. So, I think absolutely what they showed is a good example of achieving arbitrary code execution without developing a payload in terms of like a reverse shell or something like this.
Absolutely. And we're talking there about how, we saw in this article, right, how difficult it is to kind of get this hardware, to take it apart, to do this debugging. So what I wanted to show is I also around, so this was last year, I think around the same time actually, I made a challenge for HackingHub, which is called Mother Printers. And it's basically a 5-part challenge, similar sort of thing. You need to like leak the serial. It has the same code inside it, so all the code for like generating a password is the same. And then we have like the buffer overflow, and it then goes to an SSRF, because you also found an SSRF, but it wasn't like part of the chain. I was going to chain that to RCE in the end, but I didn't. But it's still there available for people to play. So if you want to go and play like what I tried to make is like a realistic like baby Pwn2Own challenge, you can still go and play that. There's also a video on YouTube, and I made this right up as a POC here and stuff if people get stuck doing it. So
that's really cool. And it's nice because that removes the hardware side of things. And often, folks, if you're familiar or you're focusing on software side of things, the hardware side of things can be quite challenging and maybe off-putting. So something like this that, abstracts things away from the hardware side of reverse engineering and so on is really useful. So that's very cool.
Yeah, CTFs continue and, to be a great way for researchers to continue to hone their skills and to learn these things. And it's from a hardware perspective, it is always a challenge to learn that stuff. You got to buy stuff, tear it down. I've broken a few things in my day, learning to do that. So it's cool to be able to have access to this type of information another way. And I think it's interesting to note from a Pwn2Own perspective, the 3 bugs that were chained there, one being leverage something that was never that was never patched to then roll back to previous Pwn2Own submissions to use against that is a really interesting strategy to submit to the competition.
Although actually, in that case, Stevens, this was the unfortunate part as well, right? Stephen, you did your research, you found loads of vulnerabilities, and it wasn't part of Pwn2Own that year. It was only introduced the next year, right?
We disclosed these directly to Brother as a large body of research. I'm going to say 2024. So this was before. It wasn't a Pwn2Own entry on our side. No.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. And we've been talking a lot.
That luck component coming back.
Yeah, I mean that would be really brutal for me to find such loads of vulnerabilities and then see that next year you can get like 100k for that one or 50k for that one. So we've been talking anyway a bit about the Pwn2Own competition this year. It's the first time they've had to reject entries. Do you think this is going to happen again? And do you have any ideas about what Pwn2Own could do? I mean, obviously it's a challenge. I don't know if there's any like great solutions at the moment. Can you think of anything? Yeah,
no, it's absolutely a challenge. I think we know we're in general for vulnerability research, we're in for a bumpy few years while AI kind of takes over a lot of the craft of what we have been doing. And the volume of vulnerabilities that will be discovered and fixed over the next few years will probably be significant. So this obviously poses challenges for the competition. Short of accepting more entries, it's hard to know exactly how to proceed. Are qualifier rounds somehow appropriate? How would that even work? But I think it's unfortunate for people to be doing the research up front and then being disappointed at not getting accepted into the contest through no fault of anybody's on either side, purely like a logistics issue. So I hope to see changes. I think it's definitely a challenge. And AI is introducing lots of challenges for lots of people. We're all figuring out this together in real time. You mentioned bug bounty; they're also being overwhelmed with duplicates and so on. We're in for an interesting few years while kind of the industry and the practitioners in the industry, we all come to a new kind of equilibrium of how we use this technology and how it affects us and what the future will look like for vulnerability research. So interesting times ahead for sure.
Actually, speaking about that as well, Stephen, I remember me and Doug looked at another, I think it was also from Star Labs. We were looking at the LLM Lite. Do you remember that one, Doug? And it was was like 6 different chains or 4 different chains. And it was like every time they got a chain, the vendor patched it and then they just quickly started diffing it, find the new chain. And it was like a couple of weeks in between all of this. And then it got to the competition. They weren't able to do it. They were rejected from going to competition. And then they found out afterwards that actually their chain would have worked if they would have been there. So.
I think too, it's interesting, even before AI, like Pwn2Own had this interesting aspect of the competition of getting patched out. Like Stephen made that comment, earlier in our conversation here, where you could work 3 months on a vuln, find out the day before the vendor patched that vuln.
Or on the plane. While you're on the plane
on the plane, on the thing. You spent the money to go to the competition, you entered, you got accepted to the competition, you got a slot to find out it's been patched out at the last minute. I think that's always been a really interesting challenge, even outside the context of AI. I've had the opinion that maybe Pwn2Own needs to draw a line in the sand, whether it's like, okay, a week before, if as long as it works on that version, we're going to accept it, or even if it's 2 days before or something like that, right? To kind of preserve the spirit of the competition of the vulnerability, like, hey, it was a 0 day at the time of discovery. And now when we add AI on top of that, like that's going to get exasperated, as you were seeing in the Star Labs perspective. What have you thought?
Just jump in there, Doug. Yeah. They do try to draw that line in the sand, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but the day before the draw, they will send out an email of the latest version of all the software that's been installed on their systems, and that is the line in the sand. So they won't accept if a vendor but it releases an update after that. So like on the day of the draw.
Okay.
Insofar it's possible to do so, you have to imagine some devices, like embedded devices, will get over-the-air updates, which nobody can control. They just get pushed to the device.
Right.
If that happens, that just happens. But regardless, even if the firmware is frozen or the software version is frozen the day prior to the draw, so it's fixed when you actually turn up. If your entry is successful, once you go to disclose to the vendor can still point to the very latest version that hasn't been actually used. And say we did know about this, so there's no getting around getting patched out from a firmware update or a software update, basically. Although the competition to make it run, they do try to address it somehow.
You think that in your opinion, do you think that's the right way to do it? Or do you think there's some room for change there? And the fact that, because even like what you were talking about earlier about saying, there's no publicly knowledge of a vulnerability, researcher discovers it, but the vendor comes up to the table and says, oh yeah, here's proof that we've been working on this, but it just wasn't disclosed. Do you think that's a good way for the competition to handle that?
Yeah, personally, yeah. I mean, it's a 0-day exploit competition. I think we could argue, I guess there is that kind of gray area in between knowing about a vulnerability and actually having a public or at least a customer available patch available. Yeah, I think it has to, ideally the entries will all be completely 0 days, completely unknown from every kind of party in the process. So yeah, to be honest, I feel it's a reasonable way to account for this kind of gray area in between when the vendor does have some prior knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point too. Like they call it a 0-day competition. So technically, if the vendor knows about it, right, it's not a 0 day in the true term of the of the definition. So that definitely makes sense from my perspective. I feel for the researchers that have spent so much time and effort to find these bugs, to find out they've been patched out without them even knowing that they've been patched out in the future. But that makes sense to me. Any last thoughts, Jonah, before we wrap this up?
Just as you were bringing that up, I just thought as well, Wiz have a similar competition now, the 0-day cloud, which I think is just all like cloud software. I don't really know much about the competition, but it'd be interesting to know how they handle this. Do they have kind of the same issues that Pwn2Own are having, and being interesting to keep an eye on both of them as they proceed to see how they do things differently?
Yeah, absolutely.
All competitions are going to be interesting to keep an eye on. Go ahead, Stephen. I cut you off.
So Wiz entered this kind of space last year with their 0-day cloud competition. It happened, I think, in tandem with Black Hat Europe in London in around November, December. So I assume it's going ahead this year. I haven't heard yet. But like you say, it will be interesting to see, do they get the huge volume of submissions, what their approach will be. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see the space grow. But given that the goalposts, I guess, are moving quite a lot with AI recently, it'll be interesting to see how everybody adapts in real time.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I think that's a wrap for this special edition of Hacktics and Telemetry, focusing 100% on Pwn2Own. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Stephen, thank you so much for being willing to join us again and sharing your knowledge as a big veteran in the industry and for Pwn2Own specifically. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and comment to let us know, and we will be back next time.